Hare Krishna. In current Indian histories, the name of the sixth generation Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb has become a byword for cruelty, treachery, guile, and fanaticism. But Akbar, the great grandfather of Aurangzeb, was much worse. Histories written by flatterers have tended carefully to shroud Akbar's misdeeds, tear to small bits all evidence, and sweep those bits under Akbar's royal bedchamber rug. It is intended in this episode to present to the viewers a sample of that evidence which is so voluminous as to be a fit subject for a separate book. Far from being noble, therefore, Akbar should rank among the worst tyrants of world history, not to speak of Bharat alone, and to rank him with remorseful and pious benefactors like Ashok or Vikramaditya is the height of academic absurdity and criminality. Even in an ostensibly partisan account of Akbar's reign, titled Akbar the Great Mughal, Vincent Smith cannot help observing on page 32 of his book that, quote, Akbar would have laughed at the remorse felt by Ashok for the miseries caused by the conquest of Kalinga, and would have utterly condemned his great predecessor's decision to abstain from all further wars of aggression. Unquote. The view that Akbar's conquests were intended to achieve the great goal of welding the lesser states into a great empire, Smith dismisses as, quote, sentimental rubbish, unquote. A perusal of accounts of Akbar's reign written by contemporaries like Abul Fazl, Nizamuddin, and Badayuni, and by Western scholars like Vincent Smith is enough to convince the reader that slavery in its most abject forms flourished under Akbar, and his reign was full of atrocities, lawlessness, repression, and relentless conquests of a kind rarely paralleled in world history. To arrive at a correct appraisal of Akbar's individuality, it would be proper to review the traditions and the standard of behavior of the family from which Akbar was descended. On page 7 of his book, Vincent Smith observes, quote, Akbar was a foreigner in India. He had not a drop of Bharatiya blood in his veins, unquote. This shows how generations of Bharatiya students have been cheated into learning by rote and repeating in their answer papers that Akbar was a Bharatiya, and one of the greatest one at that. He was not a Bharatiya. As for the other part of the myth, that he was a great man and a great ruler, we propose to prove in this episode that he was one of the most detested by even his nearest of kins and all Bharatiyas, and therefore ought to be ranked as such in Bharatiya histories. In continuation of the earlier quoted remark, Vincent Smith says that Akbar was a descendant in the 7th generation on his father's side from Taimurlang and on his mother's side from Chengiz Khan. Thus, Akbar was descended from two of the most cruel marauders known to history who made earth quail during their lifetimes. But Bharatiya historical text would almost have us believe that Akbar belonged to a family of people as saintly as Saint Francis of Assisi and Abu Ben Adhem. On page 294 of Vincent Smith's book, it is stated that, quote, intemperance was the besetting sin of the Timurid royal family, as it was of among other Muslim ruling houses. Babur was an elegant toper. Humayun made himself stupid with opium. Akbar permitted himself the practice of both vices. Akbar's two younger sons died in early manhood from chronic alcoholism, and their elder brother was saved from the same fate by a strong constitution, not by virtue. Unquote. Akbar's uncle Kamran, says Smith in page 15, quote, habitually disgraced himself by inflicting on his opponents the most fiendish tortures, not sparing even women and children. Unquote. Humayun, throughout his life, was engaged in deadly combat against his own brothers, as usual with all Muslim rulers in Bharat. He was quite a match for Kamran so far as atrocities were concerned. When captured, Kamran was subjected to great torture. Smith remarks in page 20, quote, Humayun felt little concern for his brother's sufferings. Kamran was pulled out of his tent, laid down, and while a man sat on his knees, a lancet was thrust into Kamran's eyes. Some lemon juice and salt were rubbed into his eyes, and soon thereafter he was out on horseback to ride away with his escort. Unquote. With such a tradition coming down to his own father and uncle, and Akbar's own unrestrained addiction to all possible vices, it is extremely cheeky to assert, as our histories do, that Akbar was one of the noblest humans ever born. From the description of Akbar's physical characteristics given by Vincent Smith, page 242, it is clear that Akbar's was an ugly, deformed personality, which is quite consistent ethnologically, since he belonged to a very vicious family. Smith says, quote, Akbar in his middle life was a man of moderate stature, perhaps 5.7 inch in height, broad-chested, narrow-waisted, and long-armed. His legs were somewhat bowed inwards, and when walking, he slightly dragged the left leg as if he were lame. His head drooped a little towards the right shoulder. The nose was rather short, with a bony prominence in the middle, and nostrils dilated as if with anger. A small wart about half the size of a pea connected the left nostril with the upper lip. His complexion was dark. Unquote. In spite of such ugly features, the self-appointed, self-styled sycophant chronicler of Akbar's reign, Abul Fazl, described by their contemporaries as a shameless flatterer, does not tire of asserting that Akbar was the handsomest man on earth. History is replete with instances of Akbar's extreme addiction to strong drinks and stupefying drugs. He also used to take liberal helpings of horrifying combinations of both drugs and drinks. Akbar's son Jahangir records, quote, my father, whether in his coughs or sober moments, always called me Sekhu Babu, unquote. This clearly implies that Akbar was very often drunk. Smith observes, page 82, that although panegyrists of Akbar make no mention of his drunken bowels, it is certain that he kept up the family tradition and often drank more than he could carry. Aquaviva, a Jesuit at Akbar's court, says that, quote, Akbar went to such excesses in drinking that he often fell asleep while talking to visitors. The reason being that he made too much use, sometimes of arak, an extremely heady palm wine, and sometimes of post, a similar preparation of opium, diluted and modified by various admixtures of spice, unquote. His bad example in the matter of inebriety was followed only too faithfully by his three sons, who attained manhood. Smith, in page 244, has mentioned that when Akbar had drunk more than was good for him, he performed various mad freaks. He especially fancied a very heady toddy, As an alternative, he used to take a spiced infusion of opium. He followed the practice of his family of many generations in consuming both strong drink and various preparation of opium, sometimes to excess. Unquote. Any number of such passages could be quoted, but this should suffice to convince the reader of Akbar's very vicious habits. It need not be stressed that a conscience ill at ease with an ever mounting terrible or intolerable burden of sin alone seeks escape in drugged stupefaction. All historians unanimously testify to Akbar's stark illiteracy. His son Jahangir has recorded that Akbar could neither read nor write, but used to pose as though he was very learned. It is not so much a question of Akbar's posing as of others humoring him into the belief that all that he said or did was the outcome of profound wisdom. What else could they do when faced with a cruel and unscrupulous, all-powerful monarch? Akbar's life is a good example of a Sanskrit adage which says, quote, youth, wealth, power and intemperance, each singly can bring ruin. What then when all combine? On page 31, Smith says, quote, Abul Fazl never tires of repeating that Akbar during his early years remained behind a veil. What he means thereby is that Akbar used to spend most of his time in the harem. Unquote. On page 81, Smith informs us that Aquaviva, the good means Jesuit father, had boldly dared to reprove the emperor sharply for his licentious relations with women. Akbar blushingly excused himself. Unquote. Abul Fazl, describing Akbar's harem, says, quote, His Majesty has made a large enclosure with fine buildings inside where he reposes. Though there are more than 5,000 women in the harem, he has given to each a separate apartment. Unquote. This apartment portion is of course a lie, because there is no building of Akbar's time where 5,000 women could have been accommodated in separate apartments. On page 276 of Ain-i-Akbari, volume 1, edited by Blochman, Abul Fazl tells the reader, quote, His Majesty has established a wine shop near the palace. The prostitutes of the realm who collected at the shop could scarcely be counted, so large was their number. The dancing girls used to be taken home by the courtiers. If any well-known courtier wanted to have a virgin, they should first have His Majesty's permission. In the same way, boys prostituted themselves, and drunkenness and ignorance soon lead to bloodshed. His Majesty himself called some of the principal prostitutes and asked them who had deprived them of their virginity. Unquote. A pertinent question would be, who were these so-called prostitutes? Where from did a whole army of prostitutes suddenly descend in Akbar's realm like a swarm of locusts? The answer is that these ever-increasing prostitutes were none other than decent Hindu women whose homes were daily raided and plundered, and after their menfolks were either massacred or converted, were helplessly left to fend for themselves and were exposed to the mercy of sex-hungry Mughal courtiers. Despite an exclusive harem of over 5,000 women and all the virgin prostitutes of the realm, whose virginity, as Abul Fazl tells us, was at Akbar's exclusive royal command and could not be violated without special permission by any courtier, the honor of the wives of noblemen and courtiers was itself always subject to Akbar's sexy pleasure. In volume 3 of Akbarnama, edited by Sir Jadunath Sarkar, Abul Fazl says, quote, "Whenever begums or the wives of nobles or other women of chaste (Sikh) character desire to be presented, they first notify their wish to the servants of the seraglio and wait for a reply. From thence they send their request to the officers of the palace, after which those who are eligible (Sikh) are permitted to enter the harem. Some women of rank obtain permission to remain there for a whole month." Unquote. Remembering that Abul Fazl has the reputation of being a shameless flatterer, the earlier passage is a clear admission that Akbar used to compel wives of courtiers and noblemen towards whom he felt sufficiently attracted to remain within his harem at least for a month at a time. This conclusion is further reinforced by a perusal of the conditions of the Treaty of Ranthambore. The first condition, as listed by Vincent Smith, was, quote, "that the chiefs of Bundi who owned the fort be exempt from that custom degrading to a Rajput of sending a dola means a bride, to the royal harem." Unquote. This shows that Akbar had made it a pernicious custom to demand choice women from the household of vanquished foes. Thus, all women in territories conquered by Akbar, whether commoners or of noble or royal descent, were at Akbar's sexual mercy. On page 47, Smith, referring to Akbar's extreme weakness for women, says, quote, "Early in January 1564, Akbar moved to Delhi. While he was passing along a road, a man standing in the balcony of a roadside building discharged an arrow which injured Akbar in the shoulder. Akbar seems to have discouraged attempts to ascertain the assailant's accomplices. He was then engaged in a scheme of marrying ladies belonging to Delhi families and had compelled one Sheikh to divorce his wife in his favor. The attempted assassination was probably prompted by resentment at the royal invasion of the honor of families. Akbar, throughout his life, allowed himself ample latitude in the matter of wives and concubines." Unquote. From this sordid record, it seems clear that since Akbar had an eye on Behram Khan's wife and married her soon after Behram Khan was murdered, Akbar must have caused the violent and tragic end of his erstwhile guardian. On page 37, Smith describes how Akbar's commander Adham Khan, after defeating Baj Bahadur, the ruler of Mandavgarh, sent to Akbar, quote, "nothing except a few elephants, reserving for himself the women and choicest articles of the spoil." Unquote. Akbar left Agra on April 27, 1561, and with forced marches surprised Adham Khan just to get for himself the women of Baj Bahadur's harem. Akbar's harem was thus being constantly swelled by hundreds of women. The lot of these women can only be imagined. They could not have been, by any stretch of imagination, provided with any decent living. They could only live like herded cattle, and therefore Abul Fazl's assertion that they were provided with decent apartments seems to be the usual piece of court flattery. Vincent Smith refers to another incident on page 163, which again points to Akbar's lust. Jayamal, a cousin of Raja Bhagwan Das, was sent on an errand. The garbled version of the incident says that Jayamal dropped dead on the way. His widow, no longer desiring to live in those perilous days, prepared to burn herself on her husband's funeral pyre. Akbar lost no time in chasing those who accompanied her and putting them in prison after capture. A little investigation is likely to reveal that Jaimal was deliberately done to death and his widow dragged into Akbar's harem. On page 185, Smith says, quote, Grimon's statement that Akbar had confined himself to one wife and distributed his other consorts among the courtiers is not directly confirmed from other sources, unquote. This adds a new dimension to Akbar's lechery because it reveals how women were considered as mere cattle to be freely exchanged among Akbar and his courtiers. In a continuous merry-go-round of sex traffic, they were like lambs in a mutton market being freely pulled this side and that between the vendors and the customer in commercial haggling. Then there was the notorious institution of Mina Bazar, according to which on New Year's Day the women of all Hindu households had to be paraded before Akbar for his choosing. Any number of such sickening tales of every conceivable form of lechery can be found in the accounts of Akbar's reign. In cruelty, Akbar should rank among the greatest sadists of history. Smith says in page 20 that, quote, in privately executing Kamran's son, namely Akbar's own cousin, at Gwalior in 1565 AD, Akbar set an evil example, imitated on a large scale by his descendants Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, unquote. The atrocities perpetrated by Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb were therefore not their own innovations but well-worn traditions handed down by their illustrious Sikh ancestor Akbar. It could not have been otherwise because if we believe that humanity shared its medieval cruelty and undue wage over a number of generations, then Akbar, who was 2 or 3 generations removed from Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, must be many times more cruel than his worthy Sikh descendants. Even this simple truth is ignored by so-called scholars of Bharatiya history who have perpetuated the myth of Akbar's greatness.